Welcome to Under the Lens. Come and enjoy an extraordinary, raw, and unfiltered podcast that delivers debate, discussions, and interviews about film, pop culture, and everything in between. Here is your host, film critic and journalist, Byron Lafayette.
Hey all, and thanks for joining us today for Under the Lens. We're going to be talking about The Matrix Reloaded today, the controversial sequel to the iconic film, The Matrix. And to discuss this today, I have two of my friends with me today. I have Ryan Wall and Kiefer Wynn. And we're just going to be kind of diving in and just discussing this film. So thanks, guys, for joining us. Yeah, I guess let's get started with just like some quick like basic thoughts of like, you know, what did you guys think about this film?
Ryan, why don't you go first?
No, I was going to suggest you do, but since you have so graciously said so, well, obviously, like you said, it's a controversial entry in a franchise where really the only one universally beloved is the first. But I do think it is a very underappreciated film, and I mean, a lot of things are not good compared to the original Matrix movie. And so sometimes expectations can be the enemy of the good, and I think The Matrix Reloaded, it is, I mean, far from a perfect film, but it is a really good film overall. I think it's got phenomenal action. It's got weighty philosophical angles. It's got decent character and character development and growth. It does have its downsides. I think there is a whole lot of action in this movie, and it can feel fatiguing at times. And then that's juxtaposed against long scenes where people are just monologuing, and that can be a bit breakneck for some people. For me, this kind of thing is right up my alley. So it doesn't really hurt me very much, but I can very, very easily imagine the kind of person for whom that doesn't work at all. So I think overall, fairly good film. Nothing like the phenomenon that was the first one, but also nothing like the derision you see about it online.
That's a really great way of putting it, Ryan. Talking about the differences between expectations and reality, and also the internet's desire to catastrophize things that it doesn't like. Mm-hmm. When I think about The Matrix Reloaded, I actually think of Dune, and not just because I want to talk about probably my favorite movie of the year, but because it shows like the difficulty in building out on a really interesting premise. Like the further you go along in the Dune book series, you realize how difficult it is to set out a world that can really fill out the concepts that you introduce in your first like groundbreaking entry into the franchise. And I think with The Matrix Reloaded, there's a difficulty in that the first one is so phenomenal. It's pretty much a perfect movie that when you attempt to build a world around it, you run into some problems. But ultimately, I think the movie is actually really good. I think it's a worthy sequel. And yes, I think it falters in a couple of places, but overall, I think as a film, it does what it needs to do. It provides a background to a world that a world that's very interesting that I want to see more of. And I think that movie and the conclusion, Matrix Revolutions, are both really strong films. And they make the Matrix trilogy one of the best trilogies of all time, in my opinion. So I'm happy to talk about the great things that are in The Matrix Reloaded, and maybe not spend too much time on it, but maybe defend it a little bit against some of the criticisms that have popped up online.
So, I rewatched, The Matrix for the first time, probably in a few years last night. And, and it really did amaze me in a lot of ways because, as you both said, building on this world is difficult, because that first film is pretty much as close to a perfect film as you can get. It just, everything about it is just incredible. It's a perfect hero's journey. Just everything about the whole chosen one trope is just perfectly done. And I just really loved how the second one really subverted so many expectations, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit later, but like how it just completely subverts the entire idea of like the savior trope. It subverts everything about, philosophy and control and what's really going on and the religious prophecy aspects, everything. And I also think that, the Wachowskis really did an interesting job of building the world out, because one thing that really kind of hit me as the credits started rolling was that you had a film and a universe that they had built this kind of world and this universe around a story, but at the same time, the story felt very much almost like, what do they say in video games, on the rails, that it was very much going from plot point to plot point, and all of the characters that you met and all of the incidences that happened all were directly related to the narrative. There wasn't a lot of these, like what you see now with these Easter eggs for building the greater like cinematic world or anything. It was like all of the world building that existed were there to service the characters, were there to service the story being told. And almost, it kind of reminded me almost in the sense of like a real world video game, of how you see this greater world as you're playing it, but then as soon as you leave that area, that world ceases to exist. And that's kind of what I almost viewed with like the Matrix, that like, as he's going out of this area, his instance is ending and it's starting a new instance.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I think also there's a through line through this movie that is often missed, about the relationship between mechanistic or machine, how to say, mechanistic or machine methodology and faith, and how they can be in some ways similar and in some ways limited by the same kind of pitfalls, despite being seemingly polar opposites. Because we see things throughout this film, like the absolute fleshy human, I'm trying to avoid a dirty word here, but rave party in Zion, and what you see in the Matrix and in the machines, which is just pure order and an on rails thinking. But at the same time, like, you have characters like Morpheus who are expressing a kind of faith in what essentially amounts to a cosmic code. Like, when you're talking about prophecy in this film, you're also talking about an algorithm running its course, which is an interesting comparison that is not spelled out, I think, in the dialogue or anything, but I think it is in the DNA of the film itself, and of course culminates in the whole architect scene. But we'll have to revisit that and really cut into that later.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Because there's so much to mine in, I would say the three most important scenes of it are definitely the architect scene, the restaurant scene, and the courtyard scene. I would say are probably the the three that creates the bedrock for the philosophy of the film. But I think it's fascinating what excuse me, what you said about, when it comes to the code and the religious aspects, because that was one thing I found very interesting, because Morpheus, he's always mentioning like providence, and he's mentioning the prophecy and such, but then at the same time, like you said, everything is very dictated by order, and almost the programs are almost kind of like the gods of this world a little bit. And and especially once we get to the end, when we get there to chat about it, that you see that even though so much of this narrative has been controlled by the machines and by the code, at the end, there still is that almost slightly religious aspect at the end, that you're almost kind of like, oh, well, maybe is this not a coded prophecy? Is this something that's maybe more esoteric a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great way to think about it. Particularly the idea that faith and machine thinking actually are cousins instead of enemies. Yeah, when I look at Morpheus, and when I look at the counselor's uh, message to Neo about how humans and machines actually rely upon each other in ways that can both be described as controlling. Yeah, you learn to think. You would think the movie is trying to push you one way by the end of the first Matrix, and then by the end of Reloaded, you have an entirely different perspective. And I think as a philosophical project, it has some issues, but as a piece of cinema, I think it's really interesting, and it's one of those things that I think we've passed over collectively as a critical community. Like we've just kind of we've just kind of thrown out the idea that this is a great work of philosophical insight in the same way the first one is, because of some of the other issues eventually getting in the way. But by the way I see it, I think there's so much content here that we've been talking about already that we should at least appreciate the fact that the ideas of control and mastery and faith and thinking should be given just as a big of audience as the first one got.
Yeah, I think it can be easy. This exists in an action genre that is almost extinct now, but it can be easy to overlook the fact that we have like things like the chateau sequence or the courtyard fight or the highway sequence, and think that, okay, this is just a mindless brawl of a movie where the plot is just a vehicle to get to these incredible set pieces. But the thing about the Matrix as a franchise, since the beginning, is that yes, we have these incredible, fascinating, fantastical action set pieces, but the plot, the character, the journey, the thought into these films, it's kind of the other way around, where our action set pieces are vehicles to better understand the conflict and to basically keep us from becoming either bored or oversaturated with what we're having to think about while engaging with these films. And that's kind of a reversal from what you normally expect. And so sometimes what that does is create a bit of tonal dissonance that I think this film in particular has, because we do a whole lot of sitting around and then action.
That's true. What do you think about that, Kiefer?
Yeah, I don't want to be the person that just says, "Hey, that's a great point that Ryan or Byron made," but I feel like I have to point out something when I'm thinking about the fight scenes and I'm thinking about some of the philosophy and the ideas of control and mechanics. I've just kind of realized now, this is an idea that's kind of been bubbling up in my subconscious, but I just kind of now got more of a theoretical understanding of it. The way the fight scenes are constructed, they show like the central tension of the movie between a world of rules and a world without them. And again, I know this is something brought up in the first movie, most specifically the idea of when there's no spoon, blah, blah, blah. But the way that the fight scenes add like an undercurrent of philosophical insight into the story while also entertaining us shows just how brilliant the movie is. So you're thinking, oh, well, we're just watching this great highway fight. We're watching this fight versus the henchmen. We're watching Neo versus 100 Smiths. And, it's easy to kind of turn your brain off and just analyze them on the level of physical violence. But then you realize that they're also trying to say something about how the type of anomalies that we'll discuss later, or the lack of rules, actually looks in the real world. So they're trying to show the central tension between like rule making and freedom, like within their fight scenes, while also entertaining us. Which again, you just gotta have to tip your hat to that kind of filmmaking. And I wanted to make sure I made that point before we moved on to something else.
No, definitely. And something else that I thought of when I was looking at the fight scenes too is there was this video that I saw on YouTube, and I watched it when I rewatched the first film, and I believe it's called the Corridor Crew. I think it's called. And they do like a bunch of like special effect. They're like special effects guys, and so they do a bunch of reviews where they look at films, fight scenes, everything, and then they kind of like give their expertise. And they kind of did like an overview of the Matrix, and they were talking about like how the fight scenes were filmed, and it was really incredible when they had these like stuntmen in and everything, that they were saying how groundbreaking it was of the fights being choreographed with the narrative, and just how they were doing it with the actors. It was incredible. And just what Kiefer said kind of reminded me of, like, in a lot of the fights, I kind of was, training my eye, like watching to see like, okay, how did they film this? And one thing that I really loved, especially in Reloaded, was that there was so many scenes where they really tried to show the face of the actor, so that you could tell that they wanted the actor to do as much of the action as possible. Because there was a few scenes, with some of the Smith fight and all that, where you could tell there was like a stunt man that had taken over, but then there was other times you could see like they were panning completely around on like Reeves' face, and some of the other ones. And I was very impressed with that they really put in an effort to make it as real as possible, and then of course you get the some of the CGI type stuff that goes in. One thing that I read on Reddit, this was a really funny theory, but somebody said, yeah, the graphics get a little wonky during the Smith fight. And somebody responded and they said, well, I like to think of this as that this type of combat is not supposed to happen in the Matrix. And so the Matrix is glitching out as they're fighting. And I thought, oh, I love that idea.
It's buffering, so it went to a lower quality.
That's fantastic. It's probably on the Comcast lag.
I think also we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that a lot of the things that happen in these films, of course, is they're happening in a machine, and so some things that seem to have absolutely no logic have logic if you think of it as a machine. For example, Smith himself, like, I can imagine somebody going, well, why are there now 100 Smiths in a courtyard? And if you think about it, it's a worm cluster virus, which the whole purpose of it is it goes into the data, it copies itself repeatedly and corrupts other data to again copy itself repeatedly. And it's ironic, too, that Smith would become a computer virus, given that what he compared humanity to in the first Matrix is a virus. So that's the kind of thought that goes into this stuff. Like, it's not just, oh, wouldn't it be neat if we had 200 Hugo Weavings right now?
Oh, returning to the idea of getting attached to these characters by showing their face, one of the things that is really strong in the fight scenes are the length of the scenes, like the length between cuts. Like, you get to grow. There's a sense of weight to the fight scenes that can only come through extended choreography that isn't cut short by a cut every half second. Like, we get to see like the tension of the fight scenes, like whether it's between Neo and Seraph, because we're seeing the way that their movements are begun and ended. And in most fight scenes, especially now, everything is cut so quickly that you can't really follow the action. All you have is a sense of movement. But with the Matrix, again, they're attaching us to these characters by allowing us to see the end results and the beginnings of their actions and how their physical bodies are represented. Like, it's a really interesting thing to navigate. Like, as a viewer, you're like, well, this is almost disconcerting. I remember watching it earlier this week and thinking, they're focusing on these characters for like 10 to 15 seconds, sometimes even longer. We're seeing them actually fight. We're not just seeing the end result of an action and then the next one starting, then cutting to the end result of another one. We're seeing an actual fight scene play out. And that's just super cool. Like, again, we get to feel the weight of every action and every fight because we're seeing it, for the most part, the whole way through. And again, that's something that we don't see a lot of in modern filmmaking. So that's one of the reasons why some of the characters in modern films, especially the action ones, just aren't as compelling. Like the quick cut idea is separating us from appreciating these characters.
I completely agree with you, and that is one thing I really liked throughout the entire Matrix films, but especially this one. The length is something that really does grab you, because just thinking back, to like the end of the freeway scene, where you have Morpheus is fighting the agent, and and it's just a faceless agent, whatever, but it's like it's an extended fight, and what I felt that there was like so much tension with that because we've been told throughout the first film and in the second one that like these agents are unbeatable, that that basically Neo is the only one who can go toe to toe with them and survive. And so, but you see, Morpheus, who he's giving his everything in order to fight this character, and he knows that he's probably going to die. That this is, he's just trying to, bide his time. He's hoping with his faith that Neo is going to come and save him. But at the same time, he knows maybe that's not going to happen, and that kind of tension just grows so much as you're fighting that, because you're like, something has to happen because this isn't going to end well for him.
Yeah, and I love the there's I think of the freeway as the ultimate realization of the horror that was in the concept of the girl in the red dress program in the original, because you think of these agents being able to pop in, basically like override anybody's login, and take over from there. So the freeway is an incredibly dangerous place to be, because any driver on that road can be an agent at any moment. And so like it to me comes across as the ultimate fulfillment of that threat that we got a pretty good understanding of in the first one.
No, exactly. And I think that, it's funny you mentioned that, because that was a great line that they said, that, that they kind of hope that you get it just through the impliedness of the story, when they say like, Morpheus, you always said never go on the freeway, and it was kind of a joke, of course, that like, oh, you don't go on the freeway in LA, so there's kind of a joke there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's exactly what you said, that there's no escape, basically. Every single one around you. And there is that horror with, the semi trucks, and everything, that they're just constantly popping in. And, and then that's compounded, of course, with the twins, who are just like, horrifying villains, just like amazingly constructed.
And interestingly enough, like, and maybe this, I don't know, doesn't strike you all as much as it strikes me, but I think there's like a real world kind of comparison between the fact that, again, on a highway, everyone could be possibly controlled by the machines, by the Smiths, or by the agents, while they're pursuing Trinity and Morpheus. And in real life, again, a freeway is comprised of people following very strict rules with seeming amounts of autonomy that, again, has incredibly immense amounts of danger every single day that we simply don't think about. And so I think like the Wachowskis bringing out a sense of danger in a place that, we all kind of subconsciously recognize as dangerous, but don't understand necessarily that it's kind of similar to how the Matrix operates. I don't know, maybe I'm bending spoons too much here, but I can find like a similarity between like working, like living, like driving on a freeway now, again, with our relative safety, and then the type of menace that actually is chasing Trinity and Morpheus. I don't know. It seems like there's something there. I'm not exactly sure if they intended it that way, but I can squint and kind of see that idea, and it's been really intriguing to me ever since I rewatched it a couple of nights ago.
Well, and to wrap that together a little more, the whole purpose of a freeway is to route people to their destination, and there are predetermined forks in the path. You can choose between the forks, but you can't choose the forks. So a highway or a freeway is a place that has a bit of determinism and a bit of choice.
That's a very interesting point that you make, Ryan, because I think that kind of goes back a little bit to what Kiefer was saying about the freeway being almost like a picture of life, because it almost kind of goes a little bit towards what the Oracle said about how you've already made your choice, but now you have to understand why you made it. And I almost kind of feel like that goes a little bit with what you were saying with the freeway, that there is choice there. There's forks that you go on, but for the most part, when you get on the freeway, you know where you're going. And you're going to a set location, Morpheus, and then we're going to the underpass to get out. And then basically as they went, they were faced with the consequences of that choice and basically having to understand why they made it.
Yeah, that's really great, Ryan. I'm glad you were able to kind of tie that together. These like subconscious ideas that the movie is so good at eliciting and elucidating even after some thought. It just shows why this movie is so special.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't necessarily need to be fully intended for it to be valuable. I think that's something we miss a lot in film criticism, that there are interpretations of films that may not be intended, yet may still be valid. So even if we are stretching a little bit, I don't think that the stretching is outside of the realm of fair play with regard to the source material in front of us.
That's more than fair. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think that is extremely fair, because it is interesting, because I feel like in the last few years, especially the last 5 to 8 years, as kind of the whole like internet reviewing kind of has exploded, and you've kind of seen, the film criticism world was very small, as of, I would say from, 2010 onward. From before 2010, it was people at print publications, and that was about it. And it was a very closed off ecosystem. And then as the internet has exploded, now we're seeing a lot more opinions coming in. And I think that does give to, a lot of, sometimes, like you said, maybe a little bit of stretching, but at the same point, you can find and discover things that maybe were intended, but, maybe still work, I feel that's happened a lot with some of the superhero movies, of the past few years. People are like, hey, I found this little like Easter egg here. I don't know if it's real or not, but it's real to me, or even in such weighty, philosophical films as The Rise of Skywalker, just joking.
Oh my goodness, that's like spit in my tea, man. Why did you do that?
Oh man, I actually might, now that I'm thinking about it, I might actually cut that out and have that be our cold open. Oh man, but yeah, one thing too that I was going to mention earlier, and then we got into some other topics, was that Kiefer had mentioned about how that this second film, Reloaded, that the philosophical aspects were a little bit more obvious than the first one. And I was almost wondering if that was partially because the first film did have, very weighty subjects. Extremely, with the idea of waking up and all that. But I almost wondered if, because, Western audiences had not really been exposed to the level of action and the type of action that the first film had, that a lot of those topics kind of went over a lot of people's heads because they were so focused on the visuals. Where when Reloaded came in, it was kind of like people were a little bit more used to how the film was constructed, a little bit more used to the action and stuff. So then they were able to focus a little bit more on maybe the message, perhaps.
That's a really important point, Byron. I think this is ultimately the conversation around Reloaded shows like the difficulty of following up something successful. Because I think, again, even though everyone praises the fight scenes in Reloaded, people don't approach them with the same level of awe that they approach the filmmaking of the first one, right? They kind of just kind of accept it as, okay, the fight scenes were great, and then they go on to discuss the things that they don't like. Like, I'm sure, like, if you took, a microscope to other elements of the first Matrix, you could find a couple of soft spots in the storytelling and in the philosophical ideas. But with the second one, people just kind of accept that, hey, the fight scenes are great and they're innovative and they're some of the best ever put on film, and then they just kind of move on right past it. But I think we're doing ourselves a disservice when we kind of move right past that and don't sit with the idea that this is still some of the best, like, physical choreography we've seen in Western film. So yeah, you're exactly right. There's some victimizing here of the film's legacy by people who simply accept the good things about the movie as a given. Like, hey, they're going to do this well, so we're just going to go ahead and appreciate that. But then really quickly, let's get into the stuff that doesn't hold up as well or doesn't suit our sensibilities. So yeah, you're right. The movie does kind of suffer from the success of the first.
Yeah, I think there's a goodness. It's you stated it so well, but it's like there's a little bit of been there, seen that in the mind of some people, where it's like, oh, the first one was groundbreaking and the second one was just building off of what the first one did. But you got to understand that this is coming from the same creators. So, yes, the first one was groundbreaking, but why would you expect the second one in the same franchise to be groundbreaking in a completely different direction? I don't think that's a reasonable expectation to have. But even so, even within the constraints of, oh, we're going to have very Asian-influenced action sequences that are that because it's taking place in a simulation feature feats of physical violence that are actually impossible, but we're going to have fun with it in this virtual world. Like, even within that framework that the first one set out, you're still dealing with top tier, well choreographed, well shot, incredibly well executed action sequences. Even the ones we don't always think about, the Trinity sequences in the beginning and in the end, or I think probably the most underrated fight sequence in this entire trilogy is that chateau brawl with all the weapons on the walls and stuff. That
absolutely
is fantastic scene.
100% agree.
and people just gloss over it like, oh, of course it's the Matrix, so of course it's going to be great. But that's not a given.
No, 100%. And the chateau fight is incredible, and I really like that specific scene too, because I feel like it really does help to build on Neo's character, and it really helps to build on his power and skill set. That because, it doesn't necessarily introduce new powers to him, or say like, oh, wow, he suddenly can do this. But it showcases just how much more skilled he is in the first film. We see him blocking, the bullets from Smith and the other agents. And in this scene, we see he's blocking all of the bullets from 5 submachine guns, and, one thing though that I really did like about that scene too, was I loved that they included the cut on his hand. I really liked that, because, you're seeing him as this, as basically, computer Jesus, and, and, you're seeing him doing all these feats, but then I love that they just slip in there, hey, he's just human still, he still has these weaknesses, these vulnerabilities. And yes, he could still maybe die. I don't know. We saw him die once before, but maybe he could die again.
Maybe he could die again.
Let me ask you a question real quick, Byron, just about something you said a little earlier. Did you say that you felt like people were arguing that the philosophical ideas of Reloaded were more or less original than the ones in the first?
Oh, that's a good point.
I think you said obvious.
Yeah, I want to say, yeah, it was more like it was obvious. Yeah, that I feel like people didn't fully grasp the ideas in the first one because it was more, you know, shielded by this fantastic action. You know, where the second one, it is more obvious, you know, because, you know, you've seen some of this stuff before a little bit. You know, and also, I mean, I feel like, you know, the Wachowskis, they were more obvious in this one. I mean, you know, what other blockbuster action film can you remember where you have a scene in a French restaurant that's like 7 minutes long, all about cause and effect and choice, you know, and that's the entire scene. You don't see that ever in action films.
And a monologue from Computer God.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh, that model. I mean, that's another thing. It's like, okay, you look at this. This is a blockbuster action franchise, and literally the climax of the second chapter is a monologue. Like, there's no big, let's have this brawl fight scene. It's an old guy in a room talking to someone. That's your climax.
It's a security guard, Colonel Sanders.
Yeah.
Sorry, Keeper.
Add to that, like the when you say something like the philosophical ideas are more obvious, I think you're exactly right, and I think the underrated reason why is because that's how it has to be, for two reasons. First, because it's a sequel, and in the first you get to innovate, and in the second you have to explain. But I think the most important reason why is that these ideas of determinism and of control means that every single thing has to follow on a path that follows logically from the thing that happened before. So when we're discussing like the philosophical ideas of Reloaded, once you have the principles understood from the first, it's just going to have to go one way. Like, you'll be able to explicate everything by what happens before. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why people believe that the philosophical ideas are plotting in the second one. They think that they're obvious and that they may not even be that original or interesting. And they're right. But the reason why that is because that's how determinism works. You're not going to be doing a lot of innovating if you can simply explain everything by what happens before. So I think that there's some value to the lack of originality in Reloaded, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also we're going to keep coming back to the architect scene, but you kind of have to. It's the linchpin of the entire film. But a lot of our explanation and exposition of this, and part of the reason it feels so obvious and also a bit tedious, is coming from the mind and the aptly named architect, right? It is not intuitive. It is 100% thinking AI construct. It is concerned with clockwork, you know, like it is a deterministic thinker, and it is giving us the most precise, most obvious, most spelled out, most predetermined, most cog in the machine explanation for everything that we see in this film, you know, and it is explicitly a counterpoint to the vague human intuition of the Oracle program, you know, that the mother of the Matrix, who embodies more of those motherly, and I don't mean this the way it sounds, but chaotic elements that are more human and in touch with the pathos of humanity, whereas the architect, and as an extension, the Matrix Reloaded as a whole, is more the logos. It is the logic moving everything forward. It is in a way like a freeway. There is a preset forward path that it must go on. It's not going to deviate, and it's going to be, in a way, tedious, you know. And I think that that is in a way the entire thesis of the film. And when most of our exposition is coming from a character that is a machine explaining machine determinism, it's going to feel A, more obvious, B, less free. and that has consequences in that it's hard to watch sometimes for some people, not even for me necessarily. Sometimes I just watch the architect scene just to watch it, uh, but that particular viewpoint in this film does make it more obvious, does make it more streamlined.
No, I definitely agree, and I think that it's very interesting because what you were saying of the architect. It's this cold logic. It's just like you said, cog in a machine. Oh, this is the sixth iteration. Oh, of course you're supposed to come and see me. That's what's supposed to happen. And I think that a lot of people might say, well, of course I could see a mile away he was going to save Trinity, and he wasn't going. He was going to make that decision. But I think that obvious choice is kind of what made that scene so interesting, because that scene isn't playing out from a human point of view. That we're not looking at that from Neo's point of view, because of course he was always going to save Trinity. We're looking at that from the point of view of this godlike machine, that to the machine, he was never going to choose Trinity, because of course, if the choice is, hey, go and save the human race, fulfill your purpose. And that's another point that comes over and over again through this film, of all the programs, everyone's saying, I have a purpose and I'm supposed to do something. So that when Neo, and when he doesn't even blink, he doesn't even decide, hey, what am I going to do? He immediately turns and goes through the door to save Trinity and basically doom the human race. And almost in a sense kind of believe in himself that he's going to be the messianic figure that is going to save everybody against all. He almost begins to believe what Morpheus believed, even though he was told it was a code. There's a subconscious part in him that says, I can save everybody. And I loved that point of view, that it was from the point of view of the machines, not from the human.
Yeah, that explains so much. Like forcing a human to think like a machine is going to be oppressive. There's just no other way to think about it. If you take a human's belief and intuition and free will and force them to follow the cold, remorseless logic of a deterministic closed system, it's going to take some of the enjoyment out of it. And again, I think adopting the line of reasoning that you just gave, Byron, what will allow a lot of people to appreciate the movie's depth more. Because yeah, you're asking a human to think like a machine, and as soon as you do that, you remove a lot of visceral enjoyment from it, because it does all become remorseless. You can see the end from the beginning, and a lot of the fun in the journey is on the path, not necessarily the destination.
Yeah, I think also too, when we talk about, I think pathos and logos are a good way of understanding the dichotomy in this film, and the dichotomy between the architect and the oracle. And we were talking about the failures of people to understand and invest in and feel stimulated by machine thinking. But the irony is, the entire plot is telling us that the whole reason for the Matrix's ultimate doom and failure is because of the machine inability to do the exact opposite. The architect talks about anomalies, and he tried to eliminate the anomaly, could not do it, and that the Oracle program was brought in to help correct the anomaly. And even so, 6 iterations, very good record. Granted. However, in grand scheme of things, 6 is not a lot of iterations before things go horribly off the rails. So even their best attempt at intuition on a human scale is not able to correct this cold system, after the 6th time. That's something that I think is the conclusion of the thesis of this film, which is that we have these deterministic and free will ideas in conflict with one another. We have this cold logos and this warm pathos in conflict with one another. And Neo it appears chooses the pathos, but is embodying more of the ethos idea, the synergy, the core essence of humanity with the ability to think and the ability to feel. And I think also I'm going to relate this to a movie we all love, or movie trilogy we all love. The concept of Neo being the first one whose love for humanity was specific to a person is very similar to me.
I know where you're going with this, and I love it.
Yes, it's similar to me to the concept in Zack Snyder's Superman trilogy we have, where that Superman's love of humanity is not incredibly abstract and general to all humanity, but is focused on his love of Lois. And I think in both cases, in both The Matrix and Zack Snyder's trilogy, that's more real to people. That's more understandable for these Messiah-like figures. And I think that, that is a great point that both of these very different films made, or film trilogies have made.
Yeah, that's a great point that you made, and I love that you did tie that back to Superman, because I think that it is such a great example, because it is difficult sometimes to, like you said, with the abstract idea of all of humanity. And when you look at like Neo, he is, they even make the comment like, oh, he's doing his Superman thing, that that he is this kind of Superman character. And his power, his skill set he has, even when he's outside of the Matrix, and he's in Zion, they're giving him gifts. They're basically worshiping him, oh, protect my son or daughter, and these are people who believe in him, even though once he gets out of the Matrix, he seemingly doesn't have any power. We, of course, find out at the end that he does actually have something. We can get to that in a little bit of going a little bit more from the code to the religious aspect. But yeah, that's a great point of tying it to one person versus humanity. And I think that if, in the real world, if we had somebody who was alive who was as powerful as someone like Neo or like Superman, they would need to be tied to one person, because, it's what they always say, absolute power corrupts, and having, Lois, having Trinity, those two individuals were what kept them pure and on the straight and narrow, so to speak. One scene that I and it kind of leads off a little bit from this that I would like to discuss a little bit too is the one of the other philosophical scenes is the restaurant scene, that I think it's such, or AKA some people call it the horny scene, the bonk scene.
The bonk scene.
But it's such an incredible scene, because we talked about a little bit before about how most action films do not have these long, monologues of philosophical discussion. But I think that it kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about with the architect and this kind of cold reasoning of a machine. But we see a machine that's a little bit, different, than the architect. He's out for himself and is very much of he almost does somewhat believe in his own twisted version of free will in some ways, in the sense of that you aren't making the decision, but he believes he's making the decision and creating that cause and effect. And so I thought that scene was very interesting.
Yeah, I as someone that believes like in actual like free will, like I have philosophical objections to it. But as a film critic who wants to appreciate the movie on its own terms, I think it did a really good job of setting up all of the issues that are going to go through not just Reloaded, but all the way through to Revolution. Listening to the way that they broke down these like really intense, like heady philosophical discussions to really bite-sized portions. So you got what I did there, yeah. So they they broke all this stuff down to bite-sized portions, and I think like for people that were coming in expecting that action movie vibe, they got a little more than they bargained for, hopefully. And if they were looking for it, they got it explained in a way that made sense to them. And if I can add like a amendment to your earlier point, I think that not only do a lot of action movies not have this type of philosophical insight or ambition, but especially now they lack an erotic or really romantic like tension to them. It's almost like it's weirdly like asexual violence. But here in Reloaded, they tie like the ideas of menace and erotic attraction and control into ways that actually kind of mimic the way that sexuality it can be in real life, right? Like there's like a human application to what's happening with the Merovingian, because sometimes sex is tied into power, it's tied into control, it's tied into menace. So however you want to differentiate it in the real world or diffuse it into the real world, those elements can all still be there as well. So I think like not only do action movies not have a real problem with philosophical ideas, they also have a real issue with like anything like involving like sexual desire that isn't just like explicitly corrupt or made for, I don't know, like a
viewing pleasure.
mind. Yeah. So I think like the Matrix was subtly like poking fun at those kind of movies as well.
Yeah, I mean, you have we're adults here. We'll get into it, I guess. you have, of course, the incredibly large orgy in the beginning of the film, which expresses, the full gamut of human sexuality, which I expect no less than from the Wachowskis to do so. But, that's that generalized idea. And then we get specific to the Merovingian's spurned lover Persephone, who just wants to be the focus of someone again, to be loved again, or and which is an interesting thing for a machine to feel to begin with. And all these programs around the Merovingian were supposed to have been deleted because they've either lived past their use or become corrupted, and I think in a way have, contrary to the Merovingians' assertions otherwise, have been in some ways freed by not having a specific on-rails purpose anymore. Of course, they were freed into that and then immediately ensnared by the Merovingians. So, it's not a total freedom. But that the idea then that we express causality through digitally invoked orgasm is a tie-in to that sexuality that Kiefer was talking about. And then of course we have the apex of the film is about a not uniquely, I think erotic is a better word in the truest sense of the word, not the common usage today, but eros in Greek with passion, and not just sex, but we have that personified in the relationship with Neo and Trinity, which again goes from the general of the orgy at the beginning to the specific of the relationship of Neo and Trinity, and this dichotomy between the general and the specific has one more parallel in this movie, which is between our secret main antagonist, Agent Smith, and Neo. Well, Smith now, not so much Agent anymore, but which is ironic because as he gains his agency, he loses his agent moniker. Now that I think about it, but Neo is the one, singular, and in a way, Smith is the many, generalized, widespread, not singular, just rampant. And then, of course, we add on top of that, like I said, he's become a computer virus. Irony of ironies, giving his monologue in the previous film. But viruses also reproduce asexually. So the enemy is an asexual, methodical monster. Or, if we want to really strike a blow, the enemy is an asexual violence of a sort.
That's actually a good point about Smith. When you talk about the violent nature, because when he reproduces himself, it's in a violent state. Whether he's taking over a person or an agent or Morpheus or trying to take over Neo and stuff, it's invasive.
Yeah, I love what you said about Smith and the idea of violent reproduction. Again, like, and I think whether it's intended or not, like that notion that a lot of action movies have, where the only type of like romantic love they have is either some like creepy, like kind of violent sexual activity, or nothing at all. I think the Wachowskis have the courage to poke fun of that and say, this is what it looks like on like on a microscopic level. Like, the thing that you're advocating for in these movies is just like the brutality of violence, and refusing to extend that to the other places where brutality matters as well. So again, I just tip my hat to them for doing that, if they did it on purpose, and if not, it's just simply something that's so evident there that I think we should be taking more insight from it.
But no, yeah, like I think that a lot of people say with Smith and Neo in the second film, because obviously Smith is very much the central antagonist of the first film, and he's very obviously the antagonist of the third one as well. Where he's not completely obvious as being the main villain, really, of the second one, but the whole aspect of the dynamic between the two of them is so very interesting, and I think is so much elevates him from being just your standard menace villain, because as you kind of said of him turning into the very thing that he detests about humanity, that his entire reasoning for exist was this purpose to remove viruses, and then suddenly, for all intents and purposes, he becomes human almost, because he even says, when he comes up to Neo in the courtyard, he says, somehow, I don't know how you did it, you copied onto me or something. That he says, he had this reasoning for wanting to live. He didn't return to the source. He after he was, I guess, quote unquote, killed or deleted or whatever. And so I found that very, very interesting, of seeing him grow as a character and as an antagonist, that he basically just lives to consume now. Exactly what that speech was in the first one, where he said of humans, they consume, they move on to the next, and they consume. And that's exactly what he has become now.
Kiefer, do you got something here?
Yeah. I always have a little bit, but yeah, talking about how Smith starts to move towards Neo, and Neo starts to move towards Smith. Again, I think it's it's a bit of a trope in action movies or in these long form series where the antagonist and the protagonist, they take steps toward each other to each become more dangerous to the other. And I was watching a video that said that instead of reducing Neo's power somehow to provide real stakes, what they did by giving Smith the ability to replicate himself so freely and to act humanely, in a sense, they brought the threat to Neo physically in a way that most action movies don't. Like, most action movies will show that the protagonist has unlimited power and can defeat any foe, but in order for them to really be tested, something goes drastically wrong. Maybe their gun runs out of bullets. Maybe they have suffered injuries over the course of their fighting. Here, the Wachowskis subvert expectations by allowing another antagonist to really move towards the protagonist in a way that doesn't decrease the protagonist's power, but increases the antagonist's power.
Well,
And so as they move towards each other, he becomes a true threat to Neo physically without something about Neo having to be nerfed.
fantastic. I love that. And also, I'll add to that one thing I love, right? Because there's a trope of equal opposites. You see it all the time in superhero films, or even just in comics in general. Like you see Superman, General Zod. They have basically identical power sets. You have Spider-Man, you have Venom, you have Wolverine, you have Sabretooth. Like it's a good way to have an antagonist that doesn't do exactly what you talked about, Kiefer, about not taking from the hero. But in the other sense, it can kind of run stale. I'm not saying it can't be done right. Obviously, all those examples I laid out have good versions of that playing out. So I'm not saying it can't be done right, but I'm saying one fascinating thing about the Matrix trilogy, at least in the second and third one, is with Smith being the counterpoint to Neo, instead of just making him Neo but bad, they made him incredibly different and still scaled him up in power. So, and part of that is that dichotomy between Neo's singularity and identity and Smith's sheer numbers, multiplicity of identity. But I think that it should be noted that rather than trying to make Smith an exact copy of Neo in a suit and tie, they decided to make Smith something completely other than Neo, and yet still capable of standing toe to toe and go blow to blow with him.
No, definitely. And I enjoyed how, as you mentioned, that they scaled up Smith, but they also, like I said, they didn't tear down Neo. Both of them scaled up power-wise in this film. You see, Smith able to pop up anywhere. He's replicating himself. He's going for the mainframe of the machines as well as Neo. They have, similar goal. But then at the end, you see that Neo's power level has massively increased, because they say, oh, something's coming in. I've never seen anything move that quickly, and then you see when he's flying, that that the entire gravity of the world is like shifted, and, he's just carrying this like, titanic weight of destruction just behind him as he's flying through, and it was very cool, and like you said, it was nice not seeing Neo being beat down, again or something in this film, that he was presented with a more philosophical challenge to overcome versus a physical one.
Let me add something in this as well, like as an example, because what we're saying, is really good, but it's also kind of theoretical. Like for me, I think people, when they make the Jesus comparison with Neo, they think of him, as unbeatable and untouchable, and they don't understand exactly how Agent Smith becomes a threat. And I think that the most concrete example is people see Neo fighting 100 Smiths, they see him kicking all the Smiths around, and they think to themselves, I think maybe sometimes subconsciously, that this is Neo fighting a bunch of Smiths, and not what I think is more accurate, which is to say, Neo is putting his full strength against Smith's strength. It isn't like Smith is just like one person and they're all just, I'm saying this poorly, but it's not just one person that's fighting him individually. The Smiths represent the former Agent Smith's entire power. Like that's his power. He's fighting Neo with his power, not like just physical copies of himself. So when they're going back and forth there, like the fact that Neo is, spin kicking one particular agent out of the way is not a true representation of how titanic the actual struggle is. The struggle represents the things that they can each do. Like Neo isn't replicating himself, and Smith isn't that like physical force. It's two separate types of forces that are fighting, like in that courtyard. And that's why it's so interesting. Like, again, I think people don't consciously register the fact that it is not simply Neo versus 100 antagonists. It's him fighting against the type of power that Smith is able to bring to bear at any point in the Matrix. And that's what makes it so interesting and philosophical to me, and why it's a good piece of writing to give Smith a different power. So again, I hope for people that are listening, that kind of makes some sense to you.
Yeah, that does. I think what you're getting at is that even though it's a mass of Smiths, it is still his threat is still just Smith. Like, which sounds contradictory, but it's not. And we're also unclear of one thing, like and we're skipping ahead a bit here, but in Revolution we see Neo engage with Smith one-on-one, and that seems to be a fairly equal contest of strength. But it's unclear if these Smith copies are just an avatar pasted over another person and they just have that person's abilities with Smith's face. You know, like, is he essentially using meat puppet variations, or is each one of those, to use a theological term that is also in this movie, is it sort of like the Trinity, where like each Smith is Smith, but is also not the other Smith? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, do each of them have their own unique identity and personhood in and of themselves? Are they more like a hive mind? Are they a hive mind that's just using meat puppet bodies? Or are each of them equal copies? Doesn't matter which one is the original? You know, like, these are questions we don't have answers to.
That is true, and it is something that I did wonder. I do feel like there is some sort of individuality with each one. Like, I don't know, like you said, exactly of how much, like, you know, because at the same time, you know, it is kind of the We Are Legion type thing, you know, like they are all Smith. But at the same time, in this film, you do see the individual Smiths doing individual actions, you know, like when that one agent is taken over, you know, and he responds to him, he's like, oh, you know, I am too, you know, or something. And jumping ahead, you know, to Revolutions, I do remember in the final scene when you're seeing Neo and Smith face off, and you see like the you know, the millions of Smiths all around. As it's panning over them, you do see them doing individual little things. You see one fixing his tie. You see another one kind of looking up or looking down or whatever. And I don't know how much of that is like you said, it's just like program. It's just a program making him move that way,
or
or
how
if
much
it's
of the
supposed to be,
original
you know,
program he copied over is still in that thing. I just don't know. You know, I don't know.
No, that's a great point. What do you feel about that, Kiefer?
I think that's exactly the question that I have. Like, I feel like there is some level of individuality, but there's also the larger measure of control that one Smith can use over all the others, and that, to me, makes the most sense because it feeds right into the ideas that the Matrix trilogy is trying to get us to understand. The idea of control, and even with individuality, and what the architect called anomaly. So yeah, it makes sense to me that there would be some small level of individuality, and that the Smith could control these, you know, somewhat free-floating individual physical representations of himself without exerting like complete control. Again, that's like maybe a little less opaque way of saying what the architect says. Like, they are still exerting full control even with the presence of anomaly and the illusion of free choice. So the Smiths, like, doing these kind of like ephemeral actions, like adjusting their ties or making faces, or even having conversations, those things don't represent who is actually in charge, in my opinion. They're not in charge of their own self. The Smith is, and whatever the level of that is, I'm not sure. But from the way that they interact, the way that they fight, the way that they have like their own specific ways of doing Smith's bidding, I think it's fair to say that that he's the one in control to the largest degree possible. And whatever the other percentage is, I don't know. But it makes most sense to say that he's the one calling the shots.
And is this, in a sense, a metaphor? Like, just like, anyone unfreed in the Matrix is potentially an agent. Is the idea of the Smiths and their alleged or apparent autonomy from one another, is that sort of a metaphor for this, this deterministic idea with particular regard to machines, that each one of them is in a way different, but at the core they're the same. There's, predetermined to do whatever their purpose to do is, and these are questions that I have. I don't know that there's a specific answer to this. I'm just, freeballing here in front of you guys, but are we supposed to, when we see the Smiths acting obviously independent, but obviously directed at the same time, is that sort of a commentary on the idea that each one of us is, in a way, if we're not free in the system, we're not only potentially an agent, but we are a Smith with a specific purpose. We are different only on a superficial level.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point.
Thinking about it that way really raises the profile of Smith as an antagonist. Like, to be able to control that many instantiations, with some measure of individualized, or better yet, localized control. Because if you watch the courtyard fight, the Smiths all have the same purpose, but they're not all throwing punches at the same time. They're not all kicking at the same time or moving at the same pace. They're not even in the same place. They're doing separate things, but to be able to direct those localized movements to one end goal, again, it just makes Smith a lot more of a threat, in my opinion.
And ties him into the themes of the film too, because we don't know how autonomous each of those Smiths are, just like we don't know how autonomous Neo actually is. And it seems immediately obvious to us that Smith is sort of like a hive mind, where, I don't know if, let's call him Smith Prime, the original one. If Smith Prime was destroyed, do all the other Smiths go offline, or are all of them Smith Prime and none of them are Smith Prime? These are questions we don't necessarily have answers to. And even with revolutions, you might think, oh, there is a Smith Prime and the other ones go away if that one's destroyed. May not be true, because it could any one of them be the Prime Smith, or is there a specific one? I think that kind of goes against the ethos of what Smith is at this point, if there is a specific one and all the rest are just lifeless decoy copies. It's I feel like all of them are and none of them are at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I think that that is kind of correct, because there is obviously some type of centralized Smith program, in the sense, because you do see in the new one coming out, Resurrections, that Smith is back. He has a new face, and stuff. But in the new trailers, they make it very obvious, hey, this is Smith, and he seems to have some kind of memory of before, but he's different, but he's the same. So there is some type of master program, so to speak. But like you said, it's kind of like, he is everyone and he's no one, but I think it kind of leads into one other thing that I did want to chat about with Smith, that I think kind of leads into what we were talking about with him copying, and what his exactly who he is. And I think it also kind of leads into a little bit of the whole code versus religious aspects. And that is really, as we get to the end of the film, that we see, we see that Neo suddenly seemingly has these powers outside of the Matrix. He's able to destroy the machines with a wave of his hand. But then you also see that Agent Smith is also outside of the Matrix, that he has somehow copied himself onto a flesh and blood human. And it's kind of, it's interesting. And I think it just kind of, it adds a whole nother layer, to what is real, what is not real. And as you said, is there a religious aspect to this, or is it all just code, or is it the code coming into the real world? Is the real world even the real world, or is Zion something else,
Yeah, what a twist that would have been if the real world ended up being just a secondary layer of the Matrix to keep us even more under.
Oh, man, that would actually be fascinating if that's what was revealed in Resurrections. I honestly would love something like that.
but also, we mentioned there's a dichotomy between faith and code, and I think in a way it's not always an antagonistic dichotomy, but sometimes there is a root similarity. I mean, what is from a machine thinking perspective, what is the difference between prophecy and an algorithm running its script? Like, is there a difference?
It's kind of true, because you kind of ask yourself, well, what at its root foundation, what is prophecy? It's predicting an event that has not yet happened. Well, according to a machine or a code, that would be fairly easy to do, because if you've written the entire code for the entire program, how easy is that to include a pop-up notification, early on in the code that says, "Hey, this is going to happen later on," and then of course you wrote it, so it's going to.
Well, it's like a video game in a sense. Like that's what they do, is they predict what will happen and show it for it's simulation. So in a way, like, there is this difference between humanity and machine. This idea of faith that something will come through, that is functionally, mechanically undifferent when you strip it down to both humanity. In Morpheus, for example, is having faith that Neo will come through and deliver them. And the architect is, though he would not say so, having faith that his calculations are so precise and correct that the restart of Zion is inevitable and coming as well. There is a parallel between the two that is not always an antagonistic relationship, but sometimes a similarity. And I think that's what's being expressed here. And I think that carries through into Revolutions, because I think the resolution between these warring factions kind of brings a unity to those perspectives.
Yeah, Ryan, this goes back directly into what you were talking about earlier with the similarities between faith and mechanical thinking. And I'm glad you brought us back to that, because, and I think this is an area where theology probably could play a really interesting role in helping us untangle this knot. Determining the difference between a prophecy and an algorithm, you could take any number of tacks. You could argue that maybe the difference between a prophecy and an algorithm is that at some point a major party will actively intervene. They aren't simply playing the percentages.
Right.
They aren't saying, hey, I've made this calculation, and according to what I know about you with 99.8% accuracy, you're going to do X, Y, or Z. Sometimes in a prophecy, the principal will put their finger on the scale. But then sometimes it does look like an algorithmic type of statement. If you do X, Y, and Z, then I realize knowing what I know about people and the world, then this will happen. I know human nature and humans will do this, so this will happen. So I think there's substantially different types of prophecy or oracular function that like there are questions that probably can't be answered by strictly deterministic thinking. And I think this is kind of one of the issues that Reloaded does struggle with. They want to provide mystery and suspense while also talking about control and deterministic logic. So figuring out exactly how those things work together, I think, is really difficult if you don't import other means of knowledge.
Yeah. I think also with another difference I would say between the two is in the case of the machines, we have, contrary to their assertions otherwise, imperfect thinkers, that the machines are capable of incredible feats of prediction given a large enough data set. But they are also capable of mistakes. And that's why the architect as a program could not construct a matrix by himself, because he is limited in his capacity to understand humanity, human freedom. Again, contrary to his assertions otherwise. And yet, it required, in order to stabilize the matrix, a maternal figure who is more intuitive and more in line with what humanity thinks. And I raised the question that the Oracle herself raised in the previous film about the vase. Would you have broken it if I hadn't said anything? So sometimes, in the case of both prophecy and in the case of mechanical prediction, we're dealing not with a straight line path, but a conditional. And that conditional may end up with a free agent in the middle of it, which is ironically where this movie comes to a climax. We have an incredibly well-constructed rail that ends up with Neo facing the architect. And every point to that, or every step to that point, has been meticulously planned, predicted, and plotted. Obviously there are a few things that have gone awry. I don't think the machines anticipated. In fact, they later on say, did not anticipate the whole Smith thing. They did not anticipate that Neo would completely localize his love of humanity into a single person. But generally speaking, good job. You got him to the door. But at the end of the day, that agent has to make a choice. And that is, it's unclear, at least within the Matrix universe, whether or not that proves anything wrong other than the machine's ability to predict what is going to come next.
I hate to return to this idea of sexuality and control, but one of the things that the Wachowskis did with the character of Persephone is they took the idea of erotic control from the most obvious of characters, the arrogant Merovingian, and put it into the emotionally manipulative mouth of another program, Persephone. And as I was rewatching, I thought to myself, yeah, one of the things that we've seen from Hollywood over the last couple of years of the Me Too era is that sometimes control, and particularly erotic control, sexual desire, isn't just about the overt domination of the most obvious candidates. Sometimes it's the lesser kind of insidious emotional manipulation tied to, I don't know, career advancement or the achieving of goals that can also lead to domination as well. And again, I don't feel like this is necessarily the point of the Persephone character, but I thought that the fact that they put like this into the mouth of that character was actually really interesting. So again, I'm not trying to say that they were arguing that somehow more overt types of domination are less intrusive, but I do think they were interested in bringing up the idea that less overt coercion can still be coercion, and it can stand between people and their goals.
Mm-hmm.
Which again is just not really something uh, that we see a lot of in mainstream media. Like I think it's kind of something that we all kind of subconsciously know, but we're not willing to really bring it out for discussion. So again, mad props to the Bukowskis for bringing that up, and like they kind of frame it as a pathetic moment for Persephone. She's finally getting something she hasn't had in years. But at the same time, like again, you're thinking about systems of domination, oppression, and control, and Persephone's kind of got her own one going, and the fact that she kind of like places it in the sympathetic framing doesn't make it any better. Again, maybe I'm really just being too tough on the character, but I think like I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I think also it ends up being kind of ironic that the weak point, the thing that undoes both the Matrix as a whole and the Merovingian in specific, and I'm gonna oscillate between the general and the specific here, is the fact that starting out, the Merovingian and Persephone's relationship, at least according to Persephone, appeared specific, whereas over time he grew a more general erotic taste. And we can see that in the restaurant scene, And so Persephone is just kind of existing on, but she does miss that specificity in their relationship, if I may permit the term relationship, which may not be exactly right here. But again, like the error that the Matrix as a whole, the machines as a whole make, is in thinking that Neo is going to take this specified love and apply it generally to humanity and choose all of humanity over his specified love of Trinity. And what's funny is Persephone's entire desire, that little test, was about trying to experience that specified love again that she sees that Neo has for her. And so we have a prediction, in a sense, that Neo will not choose to go to the source and restart Zion, but will instead choose Trinity over the general, which is something the Merovingian can't fathom. It's something the architect can't fathom. And it's something that the more intuitive programs and the more intuitive people can fathom. That ties into that erotic core that you brought up, Kiefer, because it is expressed in sexualized ways every time except with the merrymaking in Zion early on, which is a more general source. But yeah.
Yeah,
That's a really good point, Ryan, to point out that this is a great example of the Wachowskis subverting expectations. Like they set it up so that Neo is willing to do anything to get what he wants, and he'll allow his specified love for Trinity to be, partially set aside in the service of the larger goal. And so he kisses Persephone, and so we're kind of given this hint that Neo is going to be like the person to make the really hard choice to save all of humanity and let Trinity die. But it's exactly as you say. They subvert that expectations by showing that the specified love that Neo has for Trinity cannot be finally put aside for anything. And again, like they just do a great job of like providing suspense by showing us one thing that'll make us believe that, hey, Neo's going to give it all up. He's going to give Trinity up in order to save humanity. And then actually showing us that he does the exact opposite. But again, just great filmmaking and writing from them.
There was an interesting, since we were talking about the Merovingian, an interesting point that was very briefly mentioned in the film, and it was kind of curious to me, and I don't know if it was just if I was reading too much into it, but there was a line where Persephone is talking about him, and I think she's talking to Neo, and she mentions, she says like, "Oh, he wasn't always like this. He used to be like you." And so it almost made me wonder, like, was the Merovingian almost supposed to have been some type of prototype anomaly that ended up not going in the direction and ended up going just to be selfish, self-serving, underworld type figure? I don't know. I wasn't sure if there was more to that statement, or if it was more just a throwaway statement.
Yeah, I think it depends on in what way he was more like Neo.
Mm-hmm.
Is it monogamous? Is that the way, or is it something deeper? And it may be like, considering that the Merovingian is in a way a computer equivalent of the one, because he woke up some rebels, so to speak, except they just happened to be machine rebels,
Mm-hmm.
and started his own thing. It's obviously not Zion. It's not a good place per se. It's not a good machine and a good purpose. But as a program, he does sort of fit a proto or an anomaly analogous figure in a sense. So there's some possibility to that, I think.
Yeah. I think that's interesting what you say of almost being like a machine, version in some ways to Neo. And I think there is definitely some truth to that, because when you look at, because I feel like the Wachowskis, they put in so much different little symbolism stuff that, Persephone, herself, she was named after a Greek goddess who was the wife of Hades, who was, king of the underworld. And so it's kind of interesting, that I kind of like that idea almost of the Merovingian being this kind of like corrupted program version of a messiah that ended up, instead of going in a good direction, freed everyone and just went into his own underworld of control.
Where he was like this simulation that they ran to see what would happen. And then after he was done, it was like, okay.
No, that's actually, that's a good point, because you would say the architect, he talked about running simulations, he talked about fixing it. Well, you could say, was the Merovingian a beta test of what the human anomaly would have been, and the program went out of control, or was just discarded after being used?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
What do we think? All right, so we've done a lot of talking in the Matrix per se. What do we feel like? There are 2 new hovercraft crews introduced here. There's Zion and the Council introduced here. We focused a lot on the machine side of this stuff. What do we feel about the? I didn't even notice I used the word logos earlier, and one of the hovercraft is the logos. What do we feel about like Jada Pinkett as Niobe, and I can't remember the Hammer's captain's name or the actor's name, but what do we feel about those people?
I mean, I think they're just great characters. It's interesting to see the kind of cult leader, not in a bad way, but like the cult leader Morpheus, like attached to the real world through what seems to be a form of flame. And I appreciate the way that they have Jada Pinkett Smith's character kind of attracted to the two poles of human reality. There's like the cold rationalist Locke. I need all of my ships here to protect us against the machines, and then you have the faithful person that's inspired by the Oracle, who is never the same after he has his religious experience, who becomes almost reckless in his defiance sometimes of his commanders because he believes that he's finally found the one. So like you kind of have her not as quite an audience stand-in, but as a means for explaining the central conflicts of humanity that are kind of replicated in the city of Zion. So I think she's a really interesting character. I don't think there's quite enough of her. I'd like to see more of her life between those two poles. But yeah, I was a big fan.
That's a great point that you make of her almost being like an audience stand-in, because I think that there is a lot of truth to that, because you kind of see, in her limited screen time, but you do see that, some of the statements that she makes of where she says, basically she doesn't know if she believes the whole prophecy or the religious aspect of it, but at the same time, she's desperate enough. She's willing to consider it. And I feel like that's almost kind of like how the audience feels, that they're not 100% sure what they're seeing or what's real, but they want to believe in Neo as a character.
There's also a bit of a dynamic between, and it's probably in a way biblically informed, but I've noticed that the leadership and the fighters themselves are way, way, way more likely to be skeptical of Neo than the average Zion civilian. Or civilian might be the wrong word, because really, by the end of this, nobody is a civilian. But but the average citizen of Zion is incredibly willing and eager to accept Neo as the one, and to believe in Morpheus's proselytizing of Neo, whereas the leadership, the higher ups, and the individual fighters are way more skeptical. And part of that may just be experience and cynicism, and having actually engaged with the Matrix as a construct enough, or if not the Matrix as a construct, in the case of the Council, with this war against the machines enough that they don't feel the luxury of having that kind of faith. And even if they feel the tug for it, they're focused more on the mission, and we do get that with our other ship captains and variations of that amongst the crew. I think it's an interesting dynamic that, this is a story about a messianic figure in a sense, and in Zion, you have a whole spectrum of reactions to that. In the Matrix, it's kind of funny because the machines obviously treat him as this messianic figure, which ultimately ends up being subverted in the end because Neo doesn't know it, but he's inadvertently an agent for them, or at least up to a point is.
No, that is very true. That like it's almost like he's fed, the messianic message, and that's a great point, man. It's interesting too because I almost kind of felt like with with Morpheus, with his relationship, with the other captains and with his relationship to the council and such, that it felt almost very much like the Phantom Menace a bit. Like he almost felt like a Qui-Gon Jinn character. That the other council members don't really like him all that much, and they don't really like his viewpoints. They feel he's overly reliant on faith. And they're both kind of focused on a messianic figure. Jin obviously is looking for, the chosen one, in the person of Anakin, and we have Morpheus looking at Neo. And so I kind of felt that kind of that kind of parallel was kind of interesting.
You're right that they don't necessarily seem to like him that much, but he has something that every true zealot does. He's got that gift of belief, and belief will take you really far, regardless of how other people feel about you personally. And I think you get a glimpse of that. You get a glimpse of how zealotry like powers the citizens of Zion, just like as Ryan was mentioning. Maybe the captains and maybe the council isn't necessarily behind Morpheus, but the way that he gets up and he winds the crowd up. It's interesting that he gives that speech and not Neo. Neo is the person that, the weak have to see when he gets there, that they believe in him. But the person that can inspire them is the prophet to the godlike figure. It's Morpheus, not Neo.
That's very true. Yeah, you see like Morpheus is almost like a John the Baptist type character almost. And I think it's also kind of interesting too that in a way, when you look at the mythology of the Matrix, you see that of Neo being a tool in the sense that for the humans, he's a tool of Morpheus, who's trying to save humanity, who's trying to bring hope and fearlessness. And then to the machines, he's a tool also in order to keep the system running and to make sure that humans are still docile and still being used as the batteries that they are.
Yeah, to the machines, he is the system reboot kind of. Which let me comment as well. Let me just make a joke. They missed an opportunity not to call the next one The Matrix Rebooted.
I was really hoping for that, honestly.
But but jokes aside, I think I want to correct perhaps an imprecision with something you said, Byron. And I don't think you meant it necessarily where you said that Morpheus is sort of using Neo as a tool. But we can't discredit the fact that Morpheus is definitely a genuine believer in what he's saying. It's less Jim Jones and more John the Baptist. And I know that's not the intent in what you were saying. I just wanted to clarify.
Oh, definitely agree. Yeah, and I think that was a bit of a poor choice of words on my part. That that while he is being used by him, it's not in a selfish way. It's not. It is in a true believer sense that he feels he's found the object of his faith. And so he is using that in order to fulfill what's happening. But yeah, it's done in a very benevolent way. I agree with you.
Yeah, and you notice that Morpheus is kind of in the center. Like, for instance, when they walk to the Merovingian, like he has that place of authority, and maybe the word tool isn't necessarily apropos, but they have a very interesting relationship. Neo is the one that has the power, but Morpheus sometimes seems to be like the leader.
Yeah, I definitely do feel that way in this film, and even in the beginning, a little bit in the first one. That Morpheus does definitely feel that way, and almost I think that kind of reinforces his the image of him as like John the Baptist, because you even see in like the Bible, once Jesus had come along, that the followers of John the Baptist were going to John the Baptist and were saying, "Is this guy okay? Is this who you were talking about?" Like he still operated with that authority with those disciples in a sense. So that's a great point, Kiefer.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the difference between the herald and the king. Like in a way, and I think Neo is still very uncomfortable with his role as the one as it pertains to Zion. Like, I get the distinct impression that he is way more comfortable in the Matrix than he is in the real world, which makes sense as an extension of his character because he's essentially a hacker. It makes sense that his comfort is in manipulating a machine. And back at home, back at Zion, in the real world, he's a lot less comfortable with that the one title, that the expectations that are laid on him and the weight of that. He seems almost like it. Another expression would be like a Moses to Aaron comparison, where Morpheus is the PR guy, the public face of this idea, and there's some insecurity on Neo's part that that he doesn't quite have the faith and confidence that even Morpheus has.
You know, that's a great. I love that point that you mentioned about how Neo is more comfortable in the Matrix, than he is in real life, and I feel that that is very accurate. And I think that they're almost kind of going back to that a little bit in Resurrections, because there's a line in the trailer where I can't remember which character, but they're talking to Neo and they say basically about the machines. It seems that they said, "Oh, they made you believe that this world was all you deserved," and it kind of showcased that he wanted to stay in the Matrix. He was taking all of the blue pills, and so I think that kind of goes back a little bit towards that he is more comfortable in that world than in the real world.
And yet at the same time, the end point of his journey is bringing that ability to manipulate and to destroy and to interact with machines into the real world. The end point of his journey in this movie is becoming more that messianic figure outside of the Matrix than he has ever been before.
No, that's very much so, because without skipping ahead too much, with Revolutions, he spends the vast majority of that film, outside of the Matrix. Most of it is spent in the real world. And I remember that was kind of one of the criticisms of that film, was that it was mostly in Zion and everything, that it wasn't quite as much in the fun world of the Matrix anymore. Oh man, yeah, that's some good points, man. Well, as we kind of come to the end here, like what is some final thoughts that you each have of this film, like as you revisited it, as you rewatched it, and like what you think of it?
I was just surprised at how well most of it holds up. Like, I think a lot of the CGI complaints, maybe from the courtyard fight with the Smiths and then from the flying scene, are fair. I don't think they're necessarily overstated. It's more that they are overemphasized to the exclusion of so many other things. I think there's a lot going on in this film that should be given a lot of credit by critical eyes and by fan eyes. I think the type of philosophical depth that they were attempting here is unfairly criticized as being too insular or too pretentious. But in reality, I think it's the way that it has to go to tell like a fully orbed Neo story over the course of 3 films. They needed to take the time in one of the films to really explore the limits of how determinism works and to explore how Neo was tethered to Trinity through their romantic connection and how that connection would override all of his other concerns. They needed to bring up Smith as a real antagonist to Neo. And so all of that kind of narrative depth and complexity and subtlety is buttressed by the fact that, again, we have some of the best fight scenes, some of the best physical action scenes ever in Western cinema. So when we're talking about great sequels, maybe Reloaded isn't The Godfather or The Dark Knight, but it is something very special. It's a worthy companion to one of the best movies of all time, The Matrix. And I think we, as a critical community, again, should take this movie more seriously. And those are my thoughts on it. Like, I know we talked a lot about the philosophy. We talked a little bit about erotic desire, but overall, my main thrust of my conversations about Matrix Reloaded is that I wanted to get the respect that I believe it deserves. Like any movie with both the highway fight and the fight versus the henchman in the chateau is a film that deserves to be rated much, much, much higher by fans and by critics. That was my rant.
Yeah, I co-sign all of that. I think I think it is, as I said, a very underrated film altogether. I think there are problems with it. I think The CGI, especially in the courtyard and the flying, are incredibly dated, and it was pretty ill-advised, I think, to presume that at this time a fully CGI fight sequence of that scale was plausible to hold up over time. I think that it has a lot of weightlessness to it in that particular sequence. And then you have issues with pacing, where we go from breakneck speed and incredible, phenomenal action sequences to deep table talk on incredibly deep philosophical issues that, if you're watching for the first time, you may have to rewind to fully grasp what's being said. In the same film, it can coexist. The Matrix proved it could coexist. The problem, I think, with Reloaded is that it is the Matrix, and it is all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of the Matrix amplified incredibly. But I think, to Kiefer's credit, to echo, I try not to repeat too much, but I have to echo his sentiment that, yes, we have that courtyard sequence. Yes, it doesn't hold up very well. I think that's fair to say. But in this same movie, you have that chateau fight, you have the freeway sequence, and those, either one of those would have been a standout in any franchise. It would have been the scene of any franchise. It's criminal that this film has two of those kinds of fight sequences and is almost forgotten.
I think that's so accurate, with this film, because I feel much the same way as you guys. I think it's incredibly underrated. I think it did so much for the blockbuster and just the action film in general. And it is strange to me, that when you, especially with the action, that we have these incredible sequences, and that it feels like the film gets dragged down for just some of the smallest, little things. It's like, I agree that I feel that the Wachowskis got a little over ambitious with some stuff like the courtyard scene, that on paper, it was fantastic, but the barriers of technology at the time, were something that probably should have been addressed a little bit, and it could have been addressed even in just the sense of, setting the sequence at dusk, in a little bit darker of an environment, so the CGI wasn't as noticeable. There was a few things like that, but I really do applaud the fact that they were so brave and tenacious in wanting to film something like this years before it was something that was happening. But I think that, I would like to see this film be more appreciated, as time goes on, because I think that when you look at it with the critical eye, when you look at it with the philosophical eye, you really see that there is a huge amount to unpack. And I don't know, I think that sometimes the more controversial a film is, it's kind of sometimes a sign of, that it has more to offer, that, when people are debating it and when they're constantly talking about it. I mean, look, this film came out, in 2003, I think it was, or 2004, maybe. And look, we're having a podcast now, almost 20 years later, dissecting it and saying, oh, there's still unanswered questions and stuff. And I think that just kind of showcases, in my opinion, what a classic it is. It's not perfect, it has its things. It doesn't quite hold up to the first one, but it's a worthy sequel, I would say. Well, I would like to thank you guys for coming on to Under the Lens to discuss this film. It was a lot of fun, and it's not every day that I get to delve into discussions of theology and action and stuff. So it was definitely a lot of fun. But Ryan, why don't you go ahead and let people know where they can follow you and what you're up to?
Well, sure. The main thing is, I don't really care so much for the social media stuff, but I do run a trivia game, the Raw Quiz Show. It is a trivia game for the 21st century. It is all about direct competition. We are working on a new season. That's right, I said season because it carries over week to week. until there is one champion standing. And I'm working on getting together a full slate of 6 combatants to fight it out in trivia for the entertainment of others and the amusement of myself. So you can check out the Raw Quiz Show on YouTube. There's an incredible back catalog of episodes for you to watch there. It's trivia, it's fun, and I think I've always been a genuine believer that when you're creating content, if you're having fun, then they're having fun. So come check out the Raw Quiz Show on YouTube.
What about you, Kiefer?
Cool. You can find me on Twitter at Kiefer Wynn Writes, KeiferWynn. That's where I repost the content that I come up with, whether it's music with my band under the name Cold Comfort on Spotify and SoundCloud, or if it's writing, usually with Pop Culture Reviews at Pop Culture Reviews on Twitter. So happy to talk to anybody who reaches out to me on those platforms, and just keep an eye out for the stuff we do in the future.
Well, thanks again, guys, for coming on. And for you, the listeners, feel free to follow the Byron Lafayette Show on Facebook, which is what Under the Lens is listed under. And also, you can feel free to follow me on Vero under the same name at Byron Lafayette, and under the same handle on Twitter. I'm getting more active on Twitter and posting a lot more of my content, but I write a lot of articles and I do a lot of interviews and podcasts. So feel free to look me up on there, and happy listening.